Hello adventurer! We've come so far with this series, and now that grass map is out of the way, it's time to create our other two vegetation, which is our trees, shrubs and flow vegetation. So for those we'll use the procedural spawner. Before that, let's go to edit, editor preferences and search for procedural. Make sure you have this turned on. And then under our procedural folder, we have our procedural foliage spawner. So we'll right click under foliage. There is our static mesh foliage and there is our procedural foliage spawner. We'll need these two to spawn our foliage. So let's get one procedural foliage spawner and call it pfs underscore tree. And let's get a static mesh foliage and let's call it smf tree. Okay, let's make three folders here. One for our trees, one for our shrubs, and one for our flows. Let's duplicate these. Let's call it shrub A. Let's call it SMF shrub A. Again, duplicate those with Control D. Let's call it flow A and call it flow B. Now let's drag and drop them in their folders. So this is tree, this is shrub, and this is our flow. Okay, and let's start with our trees. So the static mesh foliage is where we put our mesh, and depending on all these settings, the procedural foliage spawner will spawn that foliage. Now here we can spawn more than one foliage, and if we are spawning more than one foliage, then we'll have to have a different static mesh foliage here. So if we are talking about trees, then we can have two different species of tree here. Before we start spawning the trees, again the trees also need data to tell it where to spawn things. So just like grass maps, let's just get them out of the way. So let's make an underlay. So after selecting these, we'll press C to create a comment box. Grass map. Alright. So just like our grass maps, we have different ways of giving the data to our static mesh foliage. So either we can have one, which means spawn it everywhere, which it will spawn by default. If you place the procedural foliage spawner, it will be like a cubical volume. So wherever that cube is, the trees will spawn there. And if you want to have the trees in a specific layer, or for the trees to avoid a specific layer, we can add that layer here in inclusion layer or exclusion layer. Also the same as grass map, we do not have to bound them with layers. We can use mask to define where we want our trees. Now that would not be as straightforward as the grass. I mean, we cannot put our mask in here. So for that we need to have a layer. But that layer can be independent of all these texture layers. And we'll call that a dead layer. Now we are calling it dead layer because we won't be connecting any texture to it. So we'll use that only to hold the data from our mask. Now let's add some elements to our array. We'll add one for our trees, then 1, 2, 3 for our shrubs, and then 1, 2, 3 for our flows. Let's search the name here. Let's go down, and after the empty level, let's call it trees. Let's call it shrub A, shrub B, and shrub C. And tree, shrub, and flow. So flow A, flow B, and flow C. So these are empty layers, so no need to connect anything to it. We'll save it. So we'll go to landscape mode, and under paint, if we scroll down a bit, I don't know why Unreal makes it so hard to scroll down. But basically here we have all those layers, our trees, shrub ABC and flow ABC. If your layers do not show up here, first make sure that you are making changes in the same material. Then open an empty level and open that again. Then you'll have all your layers. So basically all these layers would be used just to hold that data. So let's create layer info for these. Now for all these we need to add non-wet blended layer. So the difference between wet blended and non-wet blended is that wet blended layer will override other layers while non-wet blended would be there regardless of whether there is a layer present or not. So for all these we'll use non-wet blended layers. Yes. Let me create layer info for all of these. Now we need to import those masks. So we'll right click and import export. Now first thing to note here is whether you have a grid here or not. If you don't have a grid here, then take this height-map file and load a height map file of the same resolution. It does not have to be the same height map. Just make sure that when you browse to that file, there is a grid covering the landscape. So now this grid is covering exactly the landscape. So if we import any texture, then that would be applied on this grid. Now don't forget to uncheck this, otherwise you will import another height map. All right, now let's expand the layers. Scroll down and let's take the tree layers, shrub A, B, C and flow A, B, C. And now let's load all the masks here. So for our trees, there are two options, the tree large or the tree mask. Let me show you what the difference is between these two. So this is our tree mask and this is our tree large mask. Now the first thing you'll notice is that the tree large looks a bit brighter, but it's just that it has more pixels. And if you zoom in here, so the normal tree masks are the trees with the same density as you set in Gaia. And tree large is a larger density, so you can control the density with the procedural spawner. So if you want to have the same density as Gaia, then you'll use this mask. But if you want to control the density, then we'll use the tree large mask. So we'll use the tree large mask. And as for the shrub A, B, and C, we'll load our shrub large for shrub A and shrub same seed for shrub B and shrub different seed for our shrub C. Then for our flow, we have our flow sparse A and flow sparse B. And we also have a flow large. So for our flow A, we'll use the flow large. For flow B, we'll use sparse. And for flow C, we'll use sparse B. Now after you have ticked all these, we'll import them. Right after importing, you'll notice a couple of things. So the first obvious one is your landscape looks a bit darker. So since there is no texture attached to those dead layers, so by default that would be 0, which means a dark color. So when you import it, all those places where those masks are would be a bit darker, which can be an advantage or disadvantage based on how you see it. I personally like the look, maybe not of all the layers, but for some of the layers. But this won't be a problem because we can always delete these layers once our procedural foliage spawner has spawned our vegetation. Because after we have spawned the vegetation, deleting these would not have any effect unless you decide to resimulate them. That's why if you want to delete these layers, then you do that at last. Also, if you have deleted those layers and you want to resimulate, then just make another dead layer and import that mask and resimulate it. Now with that out of the way, let's focus on our trees. So let's delete this one Or actually, let's keep it. I think someone commented a while back that they were not able to spawn two different types of species of trees. So let's just do that here. We already have two trees, tree and tree 1. So let's put trees here. Let's search for our elder, okay? And we'll have a forest tree and a field tree. After that, we'll put our trees here. So select this and press this here or just drag and drop. Let's save all. So now this procedural foliage spawn volume will spawn these two based on the settings that we put here. So let's change the settings. So our first step would be to spawn them in the tree layer that we created just now. Let's go back to the layer blend. And this is our tree layer. Now remember this name and put that exact same right here. So trees. And here trees. The next thing we would change just for our trees is to have it aligned to the normal. Now that can come with a lot of problems. Like if the land is uneven and the tree is spawned at like say 20 degrees, then the tree will turn to 20 degrees if this align to normal is turned on. But we don't want it to turn the whole 20 degrees. So let's change it to 5. So now it can adjust plus minus 5 degrees depending on how much the normal is. Again 5 degrees. And here is where we can limit it to certain slopes or a certain height. Now we already did that in Unreal, so we don't need to change it. So let's jump right into our density. Now our density is controlled by a lot of factors. So some of them are the collision radius, the shade radius, the average spread distance, the initial seed density and seed per step. Now we are not going to go detailed into these settings and what they do. We already did that. You can find the videos by clicking on the eye up there. So before doing anything, let's see how the trees look like with this density. So we'll put our trees here. So we'll drag our procedural foliage spawner into our landscape. And there is our volume, which is very small. So let's go to the details and change the scale. Let's scale it around 100. Okay. And let's place it somewhere around here. Just so it includes some part of the forest and some part of the mesh, so we can verify whether it is spawning correctly or not. And now under details, if we scroll down, first load unloaded asset and resimulate. Okay, now let's go down and see. Okay, the performance is taking hit. So let's go to the unlit mode. Let's see. Okay, so this density is a bit too much. Let's increase the size first so we can have a bigger area to compare. And again, resimulate. All right. So the first thing we can confirm is it's spawning within our mask. So it's spawning in the forest, but not in the fields. Now let's see. The density is a bit too much. And I think we can clearly see two different type of trees. These are our field trees and these are our normal trees, the forest trees. So right here, this is our tree, which is here. So both type of trees are spawning. But the density is a bit too much. So let's decrease the density. Yes, and the obvious one is to decrease this one. Let's decrease it to 0.5. 0.5 and resimulate. All right. How is that? So I feel like the trees are really close to each other. So let's tear them apart. So let's increase the spread variance to maybe 300 and average spread distance to 150. Same for this. And let's see what happens when we resimulate. All right. The trees are going a bit further, but they are still in large groups. So in that case, let's increase the collision radius and resimulate. All right, I think that fixed most of our problems. If it's still not to your likings, then we can maybe change this one to 150 and resimulate. Maybe increase this to 300 and resimulate. All right, that is a bit too much. So 250 maybe. Okay, 250 is perfect. And now time to spawn our forest. Under location, let's send it to world origin. And now I'm pretty used to this scale, so I know the scale would be 2500 to cover everything. And if you look at it, yep, it's covering our landscape perfectly. So let's first load everything and then resimulate. Another thing, these trees spawned here even though there is no tree layer here. That is because for the water we are using a static mesh. And where is it? Tree. Let's put it under this folder. And in the settings we have turned on allow static mesh. So that's why it's spawning there. If we turn this off, then resimulate, then those trees would go away. And the next foliage is our shrub. Let me remove all these. All right. So under shrubs, we have three of them, shrub A, shrub B, and shrub C. So let's also duplicate these and make shrub A, B, and C. Now let's open all the procedural spawners, and under shrub A, we'll put SMF shrub A, and in shrub B, we'll put SMF shrub B, and on shrub C, we'll put this one. Let's also change this C to a random value so they all don't look the same. And now it's time to add our mesh. So let's put box food in one of them, maybe this one. And for our shrub B, we'll put, okay, we'll put this one, black locust. And for our shrub C, let's put this box food. They are not the same, right? Okay. And this time under inclusion layer, we'll put shrub A for this, shrub B for this, and shrub C for this. Also, we don't really need these two. We can add these here as well. So let's do just that and pull in our shrub. Increase the scale to maybe 200. Load asset and resimulate. Let's move down. Let's move it somewhere else where we can find all three of them. Okay, this here looks good. And I don't think we need to change anything. This one's really small, so let's just change the scale for this one. And this is shrub C. Okay, so there should be a procedural scale. So let's change it to 3 to 5. And resimulate. Again, this is not much different from trees. The density would be adjusted the same way. So let's skip to the final one, which is flow, and that is a lot different from these two. Because in flows, we'll have our flowers, and flowers grow a lot differently than shrubs and trees. So let's move on to our flowers. And for this, we'll use 3 of them rather than 1. Actually, for our flow A, we'll use 2 of them. So flow A and flow A1, just so we have 2 different flowers. And under inclusion layer, let's say flow A and flow B. Oh, actually flow A for this one as well. Okay, this will work. Let's put it here. And for this one, let's put this one here. The mesh hardly matters. So let's put our procedural foliage here. We are in unlit mode. And 100, 100, and 100. Let's see what happens when we resimulate. Alright, so they are spawning randomly just like trees and our shrubs, but not all flowers tend to grow the same way. So we'll use 2 different settings for our 2 different species. So let's say this purple species like to grow in groups. So to do that, let's increase the collision radius by, let's say, 50 and 50. And the spread variance would be 100, and yeah, let's keep it at 50. And for our flow A, maybe decrease the collision radius, and yeah, that's it. Let's see how that looks. Okay, not nearly enough. So let's decrease it further, maybe 10 and 20. Now how about this 20 and 30? And for our flow A, let's go 50, 50, and 20, 50. Okay, closer to what we are looking for. But since they are both using the same seed, it looks a bit weird. So we can change the seed for individual species here. There is the distribution seed. Let's set 50 for this, and why is it 24 for this? Again, resimulate. Okay, that looks a bit better. They are still far away. Where is it? So let's say 5 and 10, and 10 and 20. resimulate. That is a lot better now. So now these ones are growing in groups, and to increase the area the group covers, we need to have more seeds per step. So if we have 6 seeds per step, let's see what happens. Okay, much larger groups now. Let's go to lit mode. Okay, this looks good, but maybe spread the group a bit further. And that would be done by this average spread distance and spread variance. So right now we are spreading the seeds between 10 plus minus 20. So if we increase this distance to maybe 20 and 30, this time they will be further spread. I think that's good for these. So let's just leave them at that. And we can repeat the same step for flow B and flow C. And once we have tested the settings, we can change the scale to cover the whole landscape and resimulate. Unfortunately, we cannot do it on video. I did try it though. It was bad. There were a lot of crashes involved. Anyways, I'm sure your PC will do just fine. And that marks the end of this 5 video long series. Let me thank our guild members over on Patreon that makes videos like these possible. And I'll put a link to the playlist on screen, and the project files, well, they were already uploaded on Patreon after the first part, plus a few other things that you can learn from. That'll be all for now. I'll see you next time. Until then, enjoy what you're doing.